All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, April 7th of 2022. It is the first day of the Masters, and it is baseball opening day. Quite a special DFS day, but also just a sports day overall today. Excited to be here. If you missed it, yesterday I did a pretty long, it ended up being kind of a long stream about overall baseball strategy. That is now up on our YouTube channel as a part of the MLB DFS content that we've done for the 2022 season. Just calling it kind of an office hours. I think originally had called this a how to beat guide. We'll end up putting another video out here in the next couple weeks. That's hopefully a little bit more of a concise just how to beat the sport, how to use SaberSim effectively to beat baseball DFS. This ended up being a little longer winded than I intended, but we've got a nice little portfolio of baseball content here for the start of the season. So if you're knocking the dust off of the old MLB DFS process like I am, or if you are new to the sport, right, definitely check out some of these videos here. We've got the first one had Matt on about a week ago now talking baseball strategy, had Will and Matt on towards the end of last week talking about our baseball sims. And then this video from yesterday, really kind of a deep dive starting at I've been saying first principles of just kind of, what does it take to beat the sport? What does it take to be successful? How do you build a DFS process for baseball built around leverage, around getting the biggest possible impact for the least amount of effort, right? Because it's a big factor in DFS here. So go check those videos out. Anyway, we'll go ahead. Let's start getting into some questions here. All things considered, don't have a ton of questions in my queue here for today. So I see at least a couple questions to get started with. But if you've got questions for me, if you've got something you've been wanting to ask, definitely, go ahead and fire away. I know I also owe you guys a couple questions here. There's a couple questions that had come in yesterday while I was streaming baseball stuff. So anyway, we'll bounce around a little bit, but let's go ahead and just get started. I thought this was a good one to get started with here. And this was from Brian here. He said, question for MLB, how much do you boost a batter's projection if you like him for that slate and want more exposure? 10 to 20%, same for pitchers. So one thing that I do for baseball in particular is I really like to try to think about things from the standpoint of the teams. The nice thing about adjusting team totals in particular for baseball is you get a correlated what am I trying to say? You get a correlated impact on your projections for the rest of the team. So one team that was kind of popping up for me that I actually ended up getting, and I guess intending to have a little bit of exposure to on today's slate. We were talking about it in Slack a little bit before this, is the Pirates, right? Low team total here, but a team that I don't think anybody's going to be on. Kind of interested in playing a little bit of Pirate stack. So if I was interested in that, right, I could come in here and, look at the individual batters and bump these guys up. But what I think is the more interesting way of just doing this is just bumping the team total, right? So maybe, I don't know, a third of a run, a half run to start with, I think is a good starting point to kind of make that adjustment. And what's really nice about that is that adjustment then ends up being correlated. So it adjusts everybody in the order appropriately, right? It will probably have some impact on the Cardinals hitters too, as well, actually. Probably very minor impact, but a very minor impact on the Cardinals hitters. But it will also affect Adam Wainwright, right? It'll bring his projection down. And that's really what baseball is such a high correlation sport that everything affects everything, right? Like if you are adjusting a single player projection, there's kind of a meaning behind what that says about the game state overall. And I would ask yourself, is this actually a take you have more about the particular team? Now, there are probably going to be situations throughout the year at some point or another, maybe it's for opening day, where you do want to adjust just a single player projection, right? Maybe, and actually, before I say this, I would say this is also true for the pitcher. So if you were bullish on a particular pitcher, maybe, let's see, what do these pitchers look like? So one of these guys that was jumping out for me that I kind of liked on today's slate was Max Fried, right? So maybe I want to bump his projection a little bit more. Well, I would probably go about doing that by instead dropping the Cincinnati projection down, right? Because again, that's really the statement that you are making if you want to increase a pitcher's projection, is that the opposing batter should come down. right? And that's the way I really like to use these. The team totals are one of my more preferred adjustments on baseball. And in fact, it's probably my favorite sport application for team total adjustments. Anyway, with that said, though, let's go ahead and reset everything back to normal here. Get this all refreshed. If you wanted to just adjust a certain player, right? Maybe there is a singular batter that looks a little underprojected, or you don't disagree with the team total of the opposing team, but you feel like a pitcher's a little low. I always, when you're talking about individual player projections, I like to start with about 10%. And that's going to be a pretty small impact, especially for batters. But for pitchers, you know, a couple points, 1.5, right? I think that's a good starting point. I think you can always iterate from there. Right, that's the one thing That's the one thing to remember. So start with that 10% bump adjustment. Right, so maybe you're bringing, maybe you're bringing Fried to 20 points. Start there, see what impact that has on your builds overall, and then if you want to increase some more, go from there. So, but I like that 10 to 20% increase on individual players. For teams, I think I start somewhere between a quarter to a half of a run when I want to make an adjustment to the team. So. But good question. Good one to get us started off on today here. Cool. Let me back up here a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to answer this question here from Kick to the Head here. This is from yesterday. This had come in while we were doing our baseball stream. And wasn't able to get to it yesterday. He said, I have a question regarding the builder itself. I've heard on many of the SaberSim videos that the builder will always try to build the highest upside lineup possible. And even in a pool of 1,500, they are all viable to be used in GPPs when you're playing those contests. During the build process, is the builder looking at the sim variance, the bucket size, and using the player's 75% score, the 85% score? I'm asking what makes the builder choose certain players that they're heavy on. For example, past 2 weeks in NHL, builders spitting out Carolina stacks every single slate, wondering why they're always being chosen. Okay, yeah. So good question. So a really good question, actually. So the average projections and the percentiles are just descriptive of the player's range of outcomes. They're not actually used when building lineups. It's a really important thing to note. So this is really here for you. This isn't here for the builder. The builder doesn't need to know what the 75th percentile or the 85th percentile outcome for a different player is. And this is true. I know the question was maybe written a little more for the hockey side of things. I'll do this for baseball. But this is true regardless of sport, right? What's actually happening here? So you mentioned the bucket size, right? So we are bucketing the games based on the sliders that you've selected. And that sim bucket is basically what determines the player's projections are when we build that lineup. So at a sim variance 8, right, we're picking a relatively small subset of simulations. That's probably, my gut is telling me that's somewhere between like 5 to 10 simulations of each game on the slate. And we're using the average projection that those players scored in that set of game simulations to build that lineup. So when you ask, how does the builder decide what players to put in a lineup? It starts with the player projections of what they scored in that individual bucket of simulations, right? We're saying if a set of outcomes reminiscent of this set of simulations occurs in real life, like these are the optimal plays. From there, depending on where your ownership fade sliders and correlation sliders are, those numbers are adjusted, right? The ownership fade slider acts as a multiplier on that player projection that they scored in that set of sims based on how owned they are. And then the correlation slider ultimately impacts what each additional player entered into the lineup is. So some initial player will be entered into the lineup, and then all the players in the pool will have their projection changed based on how correlated they are to the player that's already in the lineup. And then we'll go from there. So that's kind of how it works. So it is a very important note that, the projections even, but also the percentiles, these are really purely for just you. They're descriptive. They are ways to visualize different probabilities of the range of outcomes for a player. But the builder doesn't need them, nor does it use them. So really, really, really good point there. So it is, I guess, in a nutshell, how does the builder decide what players to put into a lineup? It is what fantasy points those players scored in the subset of simulations that is being used to generate that lineup. So let me know if that helps. Really good question there. Cool. All right. Let's keep it going. I'm going to jump over to YouTube chat here, hit some of these questions coming in that I've seen here. Daniel said, hey, I'm playing a MLB Showdown slate. That's between a 3 max and a 20 max. What would be the best settings? I think in general for these settings questions, I would recommend sticking to the defaults for okay, I guess I see why you're asking this question. It's between 3 and 20 max. So if it's between 3 and a 20 max, I would just pick something. I would look at what the sliders are for both of those. Well, first of all, you could probably pick either of these and just be totally fine. If it's like a 10 max, probably not going to have any issues. The other option would be to turn manual mode on and see what the actual sliders are for these contests, and then pick something kind of in between. So and you can even see why it really doesn't have a huge impact, but 4-3-10 versus 4-2-9. So I would say, virtually any combination of those is probably going to build you good lineups for that showdown. And broadly speaking, in general, if you are playing a contest that kind of does fall in between the default values for the drop downs, just it's typically with the entry limit, right? Just pick something that's kind of in between is, I think, the easiest. So, but good question there. Brad said, got my first SaberSim MLB Showdown running, nervous and excited. It's fun, man. I'm super excited today. I say this before every sport starts, but baseball's special. It's really fun. So Matt said, what are your chalk and research build settings, sliders, stack rules, etc.? Yeah, good question. Okay, so for my research build, I'll start with the research build because that one's a little bit easier. I haven't been doing the chalk builds as much as I used to. So for my research builds, I will let me reset this back down to 0. My research build is always, or has at least very recently always been this. This is basically what I do every single time. So this is a single slate simulation, right, of the slate, right? Every single lineup is a single game simulation optimal. The optimal lineup that could come out of a single game sim. And I turn salary off just so it doesn't end up kind of messing with that at all. All I'm doing for this is trying to see how often certain players show up in the optimal lineup. I think if you are interested in doing this to research stacks, I would just set a stacking rule. So if you're like, hey, how often are certain 5 stacks optimal? I would just say, or what are the most likely? That's actually, I should be a little more precise there. What are the most likely 5 stacks to be optimal? Set yourself a stacking rule, right? Kind of depends on baseball. It depends on what you're actually trying to research. I've been more recently doing my research on individual players and kind of just letting my decisions on stacks follow from that. But if you want to research stacks, just put the stacking rule in there. Chalk build. I haven't actually, I haven't talked about the chalk builds in a while here. Just because I haven't been doing them as much. But what I typically, good question. Let me think about this. Okay, I think what I would do for the chalk build. So the chalk build, I guess for those of you that are maybe like, what is this guy even talking about? Last season, I was doing these builds where I would basically try to get a little extra value out of the ownership projections by running a build where I kind of readjusted everything to Vegas and then ran builds on settings to kind of try to build to just make adjustments to ownership. I will say, first off, before I even kind of go any further, we made some adjustments to our ownership projection model at the start of this season. It does kind of use more of an industry aggregate this season than it did last year. Last year, where the primary input to our ownership projections was the SaberSim projections. As of this year, it does have a little bit more of an aggregate. So I don't know really if you really need to do that as much anymore. Like I'm comfortable putting more stock into the SaberSim ownership projections this year. I think they're a lot better. We're actually working on even more adjustments to them now, so they should continue to get better throughout the season. I do think it is an interesting idea. One thing you can do if you want to experiment is change the implied team totals up at the top to match what Vegas has, right? So to do that, I typically like to use this Vegas dashboard from Fantasy Labs, right? And you can go in here and adjust the individual team totals to match how Vegas has these, right? So, you'd literally just kind of go through step by step, changing these. And then run a build, I think probably, trying to think about how I would set the settings for this build. I would probably run I would probably run like the default settings for your contest with the ownership turned off and run something like this and just kind of see what came out of that. And I haven't done this in a while, so I wouldn't be 100% confident that would give you like something that would replace ownership projections, but I do think that would help set you on the path to making ownership adjustments if you wanted to. But honestly, I think with where the ownership projections are now, I think they're quite a bit more accurate than they've been even in past years. I think just kind of eyeball testing the ownership projections, maybe giving an eye towards the, if you're looking at pitching ownership, right? Probably want to make sure that there's nothing that like pops out dramatically off in terms of what the lowest implied team totals are. But I mean, top 5 projected pitchers on the DK slate, right? Bieber, Fried, Darvish, Wainwright. So they're playing KC, Cincinnati, Arizona, and Pittsburgh, right? Pittsburgh, KC. This is not on the main slate for DK. Cincinnati and interesting, actually. Wait, did I get confused? I think I confused myself. KC and Cincinnati, right? KC and Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and Arizona, right? So there's Arizona. So kind of in line here. Maybe an argument to be made. Maybe that who's pitching for Kansas City? Maybe Greinke might come in actually a little bit. I don't think so, but maybe will come in a little bit higher owned. It doesn't seem like people are going to be very interested to play play Cleveland, but I think the ownership is going to be in a much better spot than it has been in years past. So, but Scorpion said, does SaberSim not work as well if you are forcing in stack rules like 5-3? Rather, is it better to run without rules and go through the stacks manually in step 3? It kind of depends on what you are trying to do. SaberSim, you do not need to input stacking rules using SaberSim, right? We come over here and we go, let's do this. Basic 20 max. Let's do 10 to 50K, right? Build your lineups. I am confident that the stacks that you would get out of this for virtually any build on any given slate will be appropriate for the slate you are playing. There is a lot of rules of thumb that people talk about in baseball DFS of you need 4-3 stacks, you need 4-4s, 5-3s, etc. A lot of those rules of thumb come from the fact that traditional optimizers and even building by hand like doesn't deal with the problem of correlation very well. It doesn't account for correlation in an intuitive way. So you need to come up with just like do this every time so that you take into account correlation. Because correlation is taken into account naturally within SaberSim, right? In a way that is adjusted for the size of the slate and the contest you are playing. I don't think you even really need to worry about that. Like you can probably just come in here and say, build lineups, not worry about the stacks, and you'll get some diversity of your stacks here, right? You may not get 100% 5-3 stacks if that's kind of what you're used to seeing or used to doing on a traditional optimizer, but mostly 5-3s, some 5-2s, some 4-3s, and then a couple like, 4-4, 3-3-2. Like this is a stack construction that most people probably wouldn't build with a lineup optimizer or with a like traditional optimizer or by hand. But SaberSim is saying like, yeah, no, you can make this 3-3-2 work on this particular slate, given the correlations and the ranges of outcomes of different players and the way that lineup construction works, right? So I don't think you need to put a stacking rule in. However, if you are opinionated about what stacks you get in your lineups, right? If you don't want to see this, or if you don't want to see just a kind of a naked 5 stack here, if you've maybe already committed, I only want 5-2s and 5-3s, then tell us that, right? Then build a stacking rule in and say something like at least 5 players from the same team and at least 2 players from the same team. And then when you build this will make sure that all of your lineups are only 5-2s and 5-3s, right? And then you'll have a much better pool to work from because you won't have to go and eliminate all those stack constructions in step 3 that you already knew you didn't want. I don't think this is necessarily, but if you want certain stack constructions, just tell us in step 2. So I don't think, and I would say I don't think this is like negative EV to do this, or I don't think this is necessarily bad. I just don't think it's necessary. I think this happens a lot. I find this is pretty common in the DFS world where a rule of thumb has been established as a way to make a traditional optimizer do something it wasn't designed to do, right? Somebody will say, hey, how much cumulative ownership should I have on an NFL main slate? And you'll hear, oh, max 125, right? Well, that's just a rule that somebody came up with because a traditional optimizer doesn't know what to do with ownership, right? That's very similar with stack sizes, right? We have an understanding, we can essentially prove mathematically that correlation matters in baseball. But we made a jump from that to, oh, always do 5 3 stacks or 5 stacks or 4 3 stacks or whatever. Because when you have a traditional optimizer, you have to tell it exactly what stacking sizes you want. You don't have to do that with SaberSim. So you can just ditch the rules of thumb completely. But that is not something that you may want to do. And you can set a stacking rule perfectly fine if that's the case. So. And I actually should demonstrate here before we move on that stacking rule works as intended. 5 3s, 5 2s. Okay. Nancy Drew guy said, how do you upload on FanDuel if you're using a mobile device like a phone? It's kind of a pain. Let's see if I can do this here on my computer. I don't think I'm going to be able to totally demo this. So this I'll kind of just explain how to do it. And I think we have some what's it called? Some tutorials on our support that explain how to do this a little bit more as well. This button, the CSV edit button on the upcoming tab or the live tab doesn't show up by default for most phones. So if you turn your phone into landscape mode, so you turn it like horizontal and look at it with the widescreen, a lot of times it'll show up. If it's still not showing up when you've done that, there'll be a control in your mobile browser where you can shrink your text size. If you shrink your text size down to like 50%, you will get the button should show up and then you can do it. But it's kind of annoying. Weird FanDuel thing. I don't know why. Of all of the things that they display on their mobile browser, right? They somehow determined that hiding the CSV button was a good idea. It will always amaze me that, somebody decided like, yeah, we need to save some space for the mobile presentation. Just hide the CSV edit button, which is like the only thing that even matters on that screen. So, but, oh yeah, Rogue 3. Yes. The other important step is you have to switch to I can't even believe I missed this. You have to switch to the desktop view on mobile first. This is how it works on my phone. If you switch to desktop view, then flip to the landscape, and then potentially shrink your text size, that should work. So, Brad said, had some relievers in almost every line today, which surprised me. Didn't adjust anything, just ran the lines it gave me to see how it handled baseball. Yeah, you can definitely get a little bit of an edge playing some relievers in your showdown contests. They do exist. They are on the teams. They do get into the game. They do score. The main thing is like with how often batters fail, right? Like this is really a good case study of why average projections are kind of misleading, right? Batters fail most of the time, but they have a good average projection, right? A reliever has going to have a terrible average projection, right? Most of the time, but they get in the game, and when you're trying to optimize for literally an optimal, right? Like these are the sims that basically will end up putting a reliever into your lineup. So a lot of people just completely ignore them, in my experience. I don't think you have to play relievers. I think it's perfectly fine if you say, I don't want to take that level of risk with my showdown lineups, and you want to go in and remove the relievers from your pool in step 3. I think that's perfectly fine. But I do think they're viable. And I actually think one of the cool things about SaberSim for Baseball Showdown is that they're projected, and they're actually pretty credible projections because they are taking into account how often that reliever is even going to come into the game. I think it's a pretty nice little edge. A lot of times those guys, like you get unique very quickly by playing any reliever in a showdown lineup. So, but let's see. I'm curious for this Brewers Cubs. So, I mean, and one thing I probably wouldn't do. I don't know if I'd play a reliever captain. So that might be something that maybe I think probably why you're getting that is because the ownership fade slider is up here. but I would definitely be comfortable playing some relievers, right? I have no issues with that. So that's a lot of exposure. Yeah, actually, okay. So I think I'll mention this to the team. I actually think because of the ownership fade slider being where it is by default, we're getting kind of some weird behavior here. So I actually I'll follow up with Matt and the team because I think that that seems a little weird to me, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. So I think what I'd probably recommend, I like using the 0-0-10 sliders for Showdown. It's going to give you single simulation optimals. There's definitely, I think, a pretty good argument to be made that you can include some correlation for MLB Showdown because maybe you don't need the stone optimal. Like building the optimal for a baseball game is pretty tough and maybe something that you don't really need. So I think it can make some sense to include some correlation, but I would say for now, like I'm a little more interested in playing these sliders than the defaults, to be honest, for Baseball Showdown. And I'll follow up with the team to see if there's a reason that they changed, but I would probably stick to these, prefer those. So yeah, it is a lot of exposure. So by when you use 0-0-10 sliders, you will get only relievers showing up for lineups where they are actually the optimal player in the sim. This is, I think the problem is with 0% ownership is just causing ownership fade 3 to like go to infinity. So HC said, how much salary would you leave? First time using SaberSim for baseball, I left 1,600. Bad, good, meh. I think at least for FanDuel, and we'll probably do the same, I've just been turning my min salary off. I would have no problem with leaving 1,600 on the table. I have no issue with that. If you're playing like 2 cheaper stacks, right? Like you could be playing 2 cheaper stacks and not really going all out at pitcher and build a lineup that leaves a lot of salary on the table. I think that's perfectly fine. I'm not worried about salary at all, really, for baseball. So it's more efficient pricing than something like NASCAR where like salary is almost meaningless. But 2 cheap stacks and a couple like on the cheaper side pitchers, I think is a completely viable lineup. So Mocha Kush said, haven't heard it from all the videos I watched, but could you go over some pros and cons of single entry versus 20 max? I enjoy MMA the most, and before SaberSim did singles only. Yeah, so I would say that the biggest advantage of playing like a 20 max, right, assuming that you're entering the exact same amount of money into each of these, is that you get to spread out your variance quite a bit. So in most DFS sports, like the actual expected value of lineups 1 compared to lineups 2 through 19 are all pretty close together. And going all in and playing like $40 into a single entry versus spreading out $40 in a 20 max is just really being unnecessarily risky. I think the biggest advantage by playing multi-entry stuff is that you get more shots on goal, right? Like you're essentially, playing 20 lineups in a slate instead of playing 1 is basically a very similar equivalent of getting 20 slates of sample size versus 1, right? So that's the biggest advantage. I think for I was talking about this on my stream I did yesterday. For a long time in the DFS space, right? Is kind of hard to build each additional lineup, whether you're building by hand or using like older, outdated now tools, right? It got kind of hard. Like each additional lineup would be tougher and tougher to build and keep building good ones. With a tool like SaberSim, it takes about as long to build like one lineup as it does to build 150. And those 150 are very close in expected value to the one lineup. That's by far the biggest advantage to playing multi-entry stuff. And I recommend in general, if you have a certain amount of money that you're willing to spend on that particular slate, try to spread it out into as many entries as possible for that reason, to spread out your variance, to lower your risk, give yourself more shots on goal there. I would say the one like caveat, and I don't even want to say it's a caveat. The flip side of that is single entry contests are probably going to play softer. They're going to be, the average opponent in the contest is going to be softer just because everybody only gets a single entry, right? So if you're playing a 5,000 person single entry, that's 5,000 people in that contest, and there's rarely 5,000 skilled players in the lobby for like any sport. If you're playing a 5,000 person 20 max, right? That's 5,000 divided by 20 if everybody maxed it out. That's a lot less people entering that contest, and the most skilled players in that contest are taking up a lot more equity. So I do think there's a little bit of in terms of theoretical ROI, your theoretical ROI is probably highest in the largest single entries you can get into. But because you only have a single lineup in there, it takes a long time to realize that. So I would highly recommend, playing the multi-entry stuff, getting as many unique lineups in play as possible, and mixing in the single entries where it makes sense. But like if you have, again, I think $20 is a good example, right? Instead of going and playing like a $25, or I guess a hypothetical, I don't know if any of the sites actually have a $20 single entry, but instead of playing a $20 single entry, play the $1 20 max, get more lineups in play, and throw in the $1 single entry in there too if you want to play some of the single entry stuff. But yeah, cool. All right, Reed has a question in Slack. Let's see. If I set a minimum ownership level for a player that is currently 0 but goes to 5% owned later, will he be included in my pool of players that requires 1% ownership? I feel like maybe I'm getting confused, I think, because you said, are you talking about ownership or exposures, right? It sounds like you're saying if you set a minimum exposure to a player, like 5% minimum exposure, right? But he goes to 5% owned later, will he be included in my pool of... I think, Reed, it sounds like maybe we're mixing up ownership and exposures here. So I may need a little clarification on what you're asking me here for. But or maybe you're talking about this. Maybe you're talking about maybe I'm just getting confused, and maybe you were totally right. Like a filter that filters out players under a certain ownership level. I'm not sure. Let me know. I'm a little confused. So put that back in. All right, cool. Let's see. I don't see any other questions here that have come in. Oh, here's a good one. Diego, hey, Jordan, are you full fading the Mets-Nationals game as of now due to weather, or will you just follow Kevin Roth's updates and adjust accordingly? What's the situation? When I built my lineups for FanDuel, it looked like things were mostly okay. Let's see. Or it wasn't like a big concern. No, I'll play it. I don't think there's any... I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any weather in this game. So I'll definitely play this. I played every game today. There were no weather concerns that I was worried about today for any of these games. I played everything. I mean, obviously, it doesn't look like any of these 3 games would be fun to be at, but I didn't think for DFS purposes that they were too risky for me. It needs an orange flag on Kevin Roth's dashboard for me to be worried about it. If it has orange, I start worrying. If it's straight up orange, well, if it has red, it's over. I fade the game. Red, orange, red, fade it. If it has orange, that's like the most difficult to know exactly what to do. And I would say I lean more on the side of fade. Yellow, orange, a lot of times I'll read it and kind of figure out, maybe what I want to do. But today, I don't think there was any DFS weather issues. So cool. What other questions do we have here? I'll go ahead. Let me scan back because I know there were some questions that had come in recently. There was a quick question here from Ramsey, and I won't be able to really solve this problem, but I wanted to mention it. So he had said, when I late swap, I get an error message that says entry cannot be updating because the player swap was invalid. What am I doing wrong? So this came in yesterday, so I apologize, Ramsey, that I wasn't able to help out earlier than this. Hopefully you were able to get that squared away. Typically what that probably means is that, for whatever reason, SaberSim believes that, like, SaberSim thinks a game didn't started that did, which is probably just because like the page hasn't been refreshed. So if you're getting that, I would just make sure, you refresh projections, refresh the page and make sure that you've updated that. If you've done that. The other problem is that maybe your entries file got out of sync with your what's actually on the site. So if you get that situation, the easiest thing to do is to just upload a new entries file. So you can go in here, click upload new entries, and then re-download a new template file and then upload it here. And that will kind of get everything back into sync. So HC said, what site do you prefer for baseball? I don't know if I have a strong take one way or the other. I like playing two pitchers, so I think I'd lean towards the DK side of things. I think two pitchers makes the game a little more interesting to play from like a game theory standpoint. But yeah, I think maybe a slight lean towards DK. So Mocha makes a good point here. He said, I've also got that message and noticed I was in a different contest, a main versus a showdown night game on NBA. Yeah, that's another good thing to check on. Just make sure that you're in the right slate. Make sure you're building for the late swapping for the right contest. So okay, let me keep backing up here and seeing if there's any other questions that I had missed. But cool. It seems like we're pretty much all caught up here on questions. Any other questions here for me today on today's stream? I know we've got day baseball is the best. We've got like DraftKings main slate here coming up in like an hour now. So pretty exciting stuff. But I don't see any other questions coming in here. So we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, asked questions, participated. Good luck in your baseball opening day contest. Good luck in your Masters contest as well if you're playing a little golf DFS. Quite a weekend to look forward to on the DFS side as well. Obviously, baseball going on. Still the last little bit of NBA DFS for the regular season, at least. But also, we've got a pay-per-view card for MMA. We'll have NASCAR races. Formula One's back this weekend. Super excited for this weekend of DFS. So anyway, but I will be right back here tomorrow for Friday's stream, first of all, before we rush into the weekend, 2 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. So looking forward to seeing you guys all there. Good luck again today, and see you later. See ya.